Thanks very much. Indeed, I'm out of the period that was allotted for the talks, but people are familiar with something about the Erlangen program usually, and it lives on into the 20th century. And since I've written a book about this recently, well, I guess this makes some sense, especially because we're emphasizing historiography, as Volker pointed out. And I'll give two talks here, in fact, one about the Erlangen program, and then on Friday talk about the Brillnörter. And both of them I want to do from this point of view of a participant's history. So, of course, it's historians reflecting on what happened in the past. And yeah, I'm afraid some of these slides might be a little overloaded, so I'll try to go slowly. Historiographic themes you can think about, well, group theories in the center of what we've heard about here and so forth, and the Erlangen program is normally associated with Klein and Lie and group theory. And Lie, of course, is a famous and important figure for the history of continuous groups. So part of the argument I'm making is forget about that. Because they collaborated, it is true, and the Erlangen program uses the language of groups, not the concept, but just it's a way of talking about things, geometric things. So I call them two classical geometers. What's classical geometry? Simplest way to think about it is objects in 3 space. I think that's largely what people are doing. They don't differentiate between projective and differential geometry and things like that. There are differences, of course, but basically you're interested in, here in this context, transforming objects. And the difference from maybe the very ancient approach, there you have objects in position, given in position. And here we're going to allow them to move around and treat them as identical. So he emphasizes that in the Erlangen program right away, that's a modern point of view for his time, 1872, when he writes this famous piece. So these are just general historic remarks about the context. And of course, they're working naively before the time of axiomatization, modernization, et cetera, I think the visual elements for Klein are huge, maybe less so for Lie, who was able to wander around in complex spaces with his imagination, but neither of them are rigorous mathematicians. They're working very loosely with various ideas. So what comes later and is much better known, of course, Hilbert, Brillnörter, and so forth, I would say forget all of that and think about geometry in the, around 1870. And Klein's trying to understand those different trends in geometry. That was the whole idea. So there's a transformation process that many historians have written about, and we're all trying to kind of understand. And you can then ask about classical mathematics, whatever it was, what is it that kind of passes through this transformation into the 20th century? What parts of it get transformed? What parts of it get forgotten? Huge parts of it aren't relevant anymore. And that's a challenge for historians too, to figure out like what were those things people were doing back in the 19th century that nobody cares about after the process of transformation takes place. So those are just general remarks. There may be, once Lie gets going, and then you have the book of Tom Hawkins about how Lie theory actually evolves, there may be a nice comparison there. We have the nice book by Hans Wussing, which explains the roots of group theory generally, and Galois theory, of course, transforms massively as well. And so part of what gets lost is Sophus Lie's early work. Very few people have read it. I've struggled with it. It's exceedingly difficult. And it's part of that large body of knowledge that really will be lost in the course of time. But everyone knows that he collaborated with Klein, and everyone who thinks about history of mathematics knows something about the Erlangen program. So that's sort of the agenda, what actually happened. There are philosophical elements to this, and I'm embarrassed to say, after all these years, I finally finished writing this book, and just actually last night, I guess, I discovered this very nice paper by Francesca Biagioli, which deals with the history and philosophy of the Erlangen program. Of course, she makes my point for me in a way, in that her point of view is structuralism. And Henning Heller informed me about the context of that work, in fact, that was part of a project too that went on in Vienna. And so her take on the Erlangen program is already pre-structured, you'd say, that it's somehow a structuralist approach to geometry. I think that's, historically speaking, not really what happened. So Hawkins was really the first to point out that the reception history is different than one imagines, since it's supposedly such an important work for other mathematicians. And he noted long ago that very few of them had actually read it, and Poincaré being a good case in point, when Sophus Lie goes to Paris in 1882 and meets him and talks about groups, and Poincaré, of course, is very excited about groups, but he'd never heard of the Erlangen program. Volker brought it up yesterday about reprints. So what was the thing? It was a pamphlet. And, well, I'll get to that, but it didn't circulate a lot. It wasn't terribly well known, and for a while, Klein didn't do much to propagate it either. Here's the famous part that people know about. You can sum it up in a quote. Given a manifold, and with it a transformation group, the entities belonging to the manifold are to be examined with respect to those properties which are not changed by the transformations of the group. Or to put it another way, develop the invariant theory relating to the group. It doesn't sound like a big deal. Maybe it was back then. The key thing is invariant theory and groups. Well, there were transformations, and they were standard. They were the projective transformations. So you had one invariant theory, basically. People didn't really talk about invariant theory in the case of Euclidean geometry, and so Klein will make that point, that you actually have two different theories there. And you might have other theories which, aren't there yet, but they might be of interest. That's kind of his main message. So this book that will come out soon takes up the prehistory in detail, which actually has never really been written up in the detail I give it. It also then, there's a new English translation, and I analyze the text, so you can actually see up close some of the more subtle things that never get mentioned. And then I look quite carefully at 4 phases in the reception history. And of course, Klein dies in 1925. By the time of his death, or even long before, you find the Erlangen program all over the place. I mean, in Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, places like that, really, it's remarkable that it gets a lot of play. And of course, this isn't an accident. We talked about networking yesterday. Michael Barani gave us a lot of ideas into that, and I had to bring up the name Klein, of course, as one of the famous networkers in the earlier period. And so his ability to make his ideas known through mathematische Annalen above all. That's part of the story. So my claim, of course, you can't really prove these things, but I'm saying that really during the course of his lifetime, you see 4 phases of reception. This thing really becomes an interesting story to look at how it becomes famous, known and then famous. And I'm claiming that the fact is that very few people probably really read it or studied it. The message is what came across. They remembered the message and everything else. And Poincaré himself said, yeah, it's kind of an obscure text, but maybe it would be nice to translate it into French and so forth. Mittag-Leffler didn't want to translate it, so it was still invisible until the Italians got excited about it. And we had a nice talk on Monday from Elena about Gino Fano, who translated the Erlangen program, and beginning in 1890, that's phase 2. It becomes public again and circulates and so on. So it has an interesting story to it. 4, I think, not very surprising theses that I maintain. Number 1, what I already said, it has little to do with Lie's theory of continuous groups, which actually begins the next year, you could say, and wasn't known for quite a while anyhow. The Erlangen program, that becomes part of the tension, you know, that it's associated with a collaboration, and that's very explicit in the text that, oh, well, you know, it was during the period where they hoped to continue their collaboration, but it was at the end of their collaboration, in fact, the last thing they did together. Lie's ideas get into the text, but in fact, his group theory isn't there yet. So when he talks about groups, it's a way of describing families of transformations that are closed. That's it. And so it is important from the point of view of an invariant theory of a known transformation group. And so the emphasis is on invariance. That comes, of course, that's already there. And Klepsch was a big figure for that point of view. The Euclidean group, what he calls the Hauptgruppe, was very important in the text and later very important for rigid body mechanics. And so he talks about ways of differentiating certain types of properties in rigid body mechanics later. And that's the beginning of a sort of physicalist motivation, which shows up very big when relativity theory comes along. And then you've got the Lorentz group or things like that. So these all play into the story. So I call it a work in progress because he's, after all, very young, right? And he's certain things he doesn't know. He doesn't know affine geometry. One of the most obvious ways of going from projective geometry to the next case, well, he's never heard of it, and that doesn't appear in the Erlangen program. He learns it later. Yeah, there are many examples like that. You can see, especially when you look at his correspondence, that he's really learning as he goes. Just to identify some dates and people, he is very, very influenced by Plucker's mathematics, and then after Plucker's death by Klepsch. But he only stays in Göttingen 9 months and runs off, wants to see the world, and those plans are only partially realized because of the Franco-Prussian War. But the big deal is he meets Sophus Lie, and you'd have to say among mathematicians, what's the success story here? Partly luck, of course, partly a certain amount of brilliance, but an incredible nose for brilliant people. Sophus Lie was an unknown Norwegian. Nobody was thinking about the second Abel or something like that, which he came to be regarded as the second great Norwegian mathematician. So he meets him and he's immediately struck by this guy's brilliance. And he presents his work because he doesn't have great German. And so he presents his work in Kummer's seminar, and then they work together in Paris. Klepsch is a really important second figure, and I want to mention that Francois Lie has been working on Klepsch quite a bit, and it's about time historians put him on the map much more. He's a terribly important figure in many, many respects, and you can't understand somebody like Klein without, first of all, recognizing he's the youngest member of the Klepsch school. So all these other people like Noether, whom he also meets in Göttingen and so forth. The networking begins there because there's already a network that Klepsch has established. But as I said, he leaves and goes on and meets Lie, who's 7 years older almost, and has a strong, very unique kind of approach to geometry inspired by his readings of Poncelet and Plucker and so forth. Nobody really understands him, and even Klein has great difficulty understanding him, even though they meet every day and talk about mathematics. Line geometry was new and invented by Plucker, and they're both really experts in that area. So what about group theory? Well, here's the standard story. They're in Paris, and Klein, of course, hints at this standard story in his collected works. So this is part of his participant's history. He gets to package his own work at the end of his life. Volume 1 is particularly interesting. How does he deal with the Erlangen program in Volume 1? And line geometry, which was the main thing he was doing before, that's a whole bunch of early work. So it's in 3 pieces: line geometry, non-Euclidean geometry, zum Erlangen program, everything else. We'll see it at the end. I'll show you what's in the collected works. But he packages everything, makes commentary like this, and suggests that the work of Camille Jordan was important, and of course it's famous in the history of group theory. But it's of course a bit of a, if you notice a book with 7 seals, that's clear. He hadn't read it. He understands that Galois theory is important, but Serret also has a book on Galois theory. And I mean, it's, how important are groups at this point? I don't think they're there yet because they're thinking about totally other things, and I'll just take us very gently through some of that. But I claim there's little influence on either one of them in 1870. Of course, later on, it's very important for Lie, the analogy with substitution groups. But they are geometers, not algebraists, and so Dabou is the main one they connect with. And there's been some recent interest in Dabou's, of course he's well known in differential geometry and also known as an important figure for the journal that he started. But for them, I think the biggest deal is so-called French sphere geometry. Lie will invent a slightly different variant of that, Lie's sphere geometry. So spheres, that's pretty obvious, are 4-dimensional in 3 space. You need the center and radius, so you need 4 coordinates. Line geometry is also 4-dimensional, and Dabou has some kind of hints of things. Basically, this type of geometry is envelopes of spheres. So surfaces, quartic surfaces, you get as envelopes of spheres. You get the same type of thing in line complexes. So I will give no details. Anyone wants to know, they can read about this in the book if they want. These were the things that excited them, analogies between this new type of geometry and the line geometry they knew about. And luckily there are letters, which has still never been published, but I drew on letters from Klein to Lie because after the Franco-Prussian War they're apart, and these letters are very insightful as to what they're thinking about. So they are part actually until, well, Lie returns to Norway at the end of 1871, and he comes back to Germany just as Klein got the roof to go to Göttingen, so to leave Göttingen to go to Erlangen. So the Erlanger program is part of this appointment that Klein receives. And before all of that happens, he's thinking about methods in geometry. So this is what you get out of these letters. You can see this work in progress. I'm trying to figure out what are all these different things that are going on. He writes to Max Noether as well, so we have two different sources to look at there. He's very excited about Grassmann, reading Grassmann, incredible, obscure genius, at the level at least of Otto Hesse. Very impressive. That's what he writes to Sophus Lie. Trying to understand quaternions, reading Hermann Hankel. He learns about non-Euclidean geometry and also about Stautz's work from an Austrian, Otto Stolz. A whole bunch of things happen all at once. And they will have huge importance. Of course, Beltrami's work on non-Euclidean geometry, that was kind of a final key for Klein figuring out that you could take the Cayley metric and use a certain quadratic as an absolute figure, and then look at the metric for certain types of quadrics and get non-Euclidean geometry as well as spherical geometry, or what he called elliptic geometry. It's actually the case. So very, very famous things happen all at once. But what about methods? Well, is there some underlying thing here? This is typical of Klein's point of view, right? He's looking for something at a higher level which will unify it. And then, okay, something called groups, maybe a unifying idea. So he had sent a draft of this early paper, and Lie responded positively, but also with some comments about not understanding what methods really meant. And that doesn't exist anymore. That draft was junked. Then a bunch of controversy about non-Euclidean geometry takes place. That's another story almost, but all this happens at once. And so Klein is, he has a bunch of ideas on the table, and then he gets this call to Erlangen. Now, the Erlangen program is the usual thing that this thing is called, but that's really, no. The actual title, translated into English, Comparative Reflections on Recent Geometrical Research. That's what it was about. And it was not a program really for research, or maybe Lie thought it was, but for Klein it was more an attempt to embrace what was there already. And it's then really confusing to call it the Erlangen program, when in fact every professor who came to Erlangen had to write a Programmschrift. So it just got dubbed that, and of course all of the other Programmschriften are forgotten. The actual title is to my way of thinking, very apt. So what was he comparing then? Well, that's where it's also a bit surprising, because we tend to modernize all these things and think he has, the group and the various things. Actually, there are really only two, reasonably developed methods. And one is Euclidean geometry, so analytic Euclidean geometry with the orthogonal group, if you like. And the other is projective geometry. And then there's something that's sort of developing through the French tradition, conformal geometry, but that's not really, the invariants aren't there, and then he mentions these other things, birational geometry, topology analysis, cetus. I mean, it's all in the text that he's thinking about other stuff, but basically he emphasizes two approaches to geometry that are really developed at that time. So that's sort of disappointing if you think about this is such a profound work. It's interpreted by various people. So Gino Fano, I mentioned already, has a long article in German Encyclopedia, and Elie Catin used that to make his version of this topic, really, right? The role of continuous groups in geometry. 1915, lots has happened in the meantime. Sophus Lie is long dead. And Catin basically, because I threw out that message that we tend to know about the Erlangen program, he threw that out and talked about isomorphic groups being identical geometries. That basically it's a classification scheme for geometries. And this you find in Catin. I mean, it basically puts that equivalent geometries he talks about. So I want to try to hit that on the head right now. Is that correct? From the early point of view, obviously it's a legitimate mathematical point of view, but what does Klein actually say in the text? Because you can easily think that that's what he meant. So he talks about Übertragungsprinzipien. And here, you know, the subtext is what matters here. You know, you can easily misread this. So I'm saying let's maybe minimize this interpretation of Catin and look at what Klein is actually doing when he's working with Lie, and what is he talking about with concrete examples. So that what he says is very, very, it's very imprecise and unclear. Talks about Abbildungen, so that's already got that Bild in it that you have to keep track of. Again, for Klein, a Bild is very important. Abbildungen, Übertragungen, carrying over some structure to another structure. In English, we say a mapping, and then you have an automorphism group that acts on R. So if you have the right kind of mapping, then that group action will carry over to the other space. And so the implication is that if you know one group action and you have such a proper mapping, he doesn't tell you what that is exactly, then you'll have a geometry in the other space. And he then asserts that since the groups are identical, Rebecca's shaking her head, no, that's your mathematical training that's getting in the way. I mean, this is all he says, basically. You have to read it in the original, but he basically just says, that's it. If you have that, then the groups are identical, and that's all you need. The geometries must then be essentially the same thing. And that's also how Catin interprets it. Yeah, so I mentioned here, you know, that, where did I say this? Yeah, Catin's view. If the transformations groups for two geometries are isomorphic, the game is over. That is to say, from a modern point of view, if you accept this, then there's nothing more to know, because you're classifying geometry, so that's what you want. It's a way to do it. Klein seems to be saying that, and I maintain that's not what he meant at all. And it's actually where the game begins, so to speak, because it's an invitation to explore the geometry you don't know yet. And so you have a way of carrying over this, and of course, if you have invariant theory associated with the group, then you already know something through this mapping about the geometry of the other space. So it's not classifying things at all. It's actually trying to get into something you don't know from something you do know. Let me be a little more specific. So, this is The Cayley metric is really important, not just for non-Euclidean geometry, but also for line geometry as well. I think I'll skip over this. This is just standard stuff about projective geometry and how invariants give you something interesting, like inflection points of curves or something. We can skip that. So this connection between German line geometry and French sphere geometry, that's a good example of the type of thing I just mentioned. So just a couple things about line geometry. I said lines in space are four-dimensional, and the typical way to get them analytically is like this. So you get these 6 pik as the subdeterminants, the 2x2 determinants, and they satisfy this identity. So you get this quadratic condition on P5, which cuts out then a four-dimensional object, and Klein will then identify the points on P with the lines in space. And so you can, of course, ask then, if I take the linear transformations that leave that quadric invariant, okay, that's just an abstract way of saying something, but those points stand for lines, and that turns out to be identical with the linear maps on linear and dual maps on 3 space. And so he could then interpret line geometry basically as invariant theory of that gadget, of that particular quadric. The whole philosophy behind this comes from Plucker, actually, that you can keep the group the same, but you keep varying the geometry and the content and the visual aspect by picking new space elements out. The line in space being the simplest example. Klein takes line complexes as space elements. Later he takes cubic surfaces and looks at the space of all cubics and so forth. And so he's playing with this all the time. This is kind of a, but it's always visually oriented. It's very, very much connected with the real numbers, so to speak. And the most famous example of this type of transformation that they were talking about is Lie's line to sphere transformation, which he discovers in Paris at the time of when they're working together, that he finally figures things out. And its most spectacular result was finding, well, there are these sorts of quadrics that or quartics, I should say, that the French had. And under this mapping, if you pull it back, then you get a quartic in line geometry that was well known, the Kummer surface, recently well known, and you get the asymptotic curves on that. So this is, after Klein leaves Paris in a hurry, he's back home, and he and Lie were trying to figure out what these asymptotic curves look like. They knew they were algebraic curves of degree 16, and Klein thought he had understood their geometry, but he had a model at home, and then he saw, oh no, that wasn't quite right, what I told you, and so forth, and he makes this drawing. And so this is probably what the French sentries, one of the things they saw and thought of invading armies or something from Germany and so forth. That was the month that Lie had to spend in prison in Fontainebleau because he had these letters of Klein in his possession. What are these things he's drawing here? I just can give you the picture, the 3 of these crossing conics in the planes of a Kummer surface. So that's a kind of close-up blow-up of 3 of the 48 sectors of negative curvature. You can only see asymptotic curves and portions of the surface that have negative curvature. I mean, it's enough to give you the flavor. This is pretty high-powered mathematics they're doing, and it's a mixture of different methods and things. It's what we would today think of as differential geometry. And it's picked up in a classic book by Hudson. So that's the picture I pulled off of it. You know, this becomes well-known knowledge. And about Kummer surfaces. Let's see, I think I'm about out of time, aren't I? Or, yeah. Okay, so let me skip over to, this is just how Klein promotes the Erlangen program, and then the thing falls apart, and I did promise to say something about how it appears in his collected works. So, in fact, here are the works from the very end of his career on relativity theory. He puts this all under zum Erlanger program. So it's all about groups now. And relativity theory has different groups, depending on whether it's a special relativity or general relativity. And then just to sum up what I've said here, number one, the main point about Lie groups is a very complex story that Hawkins and others have written about. You can probably see a lot of parallels in Klein's own work on finite and discrete groups, which take place, but this is not much connected to the Erlanger program. And all of this is part of major transitions that took place over 50 years. So the summation of what I had to say here is really this last point, that the original context and what's in the text itself, one shouldn't read all these things into it because they really didn't play much of a role in those later developments. Those are intellectual connections one can make, but in fact, on the ground, that's not what these people were doing. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Michael. Wonderful analysis. I'm really interested in whether your research speaks to the role that the reimagination of the Erlangen program played in what we might identify as the programmization of mathematical research in the ensuing decades. So is there a sense in which the effort to retrospectively create an idea of an Erlangen program sets the stage for recasting mathematical research on programmatic terms in, say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s?
Well, so this would be phase 4, that to the extent that I write about it in the book. So phase 4 talks about these things in relativity theory, and of course Einstein's theory, the general theory of relativity, had a huge impact on mathematics, etc., and leads to programmatic research of various sorts. And so I write there about some of the debates among differential geometers. So I've mentioned Clatin here, who picked up on groups and embedded that in a modernized approach to differential geometry that Oswald Veblen didn't care for.
Yeah.
And maybe you know that story. I mean, so that's the one thing in the book that I deal with in some detail, that at that stage, and the Erlanger program is this very famous thing, and Veblen is saying, no, we don't need that anymore. This isn't helpful. And they have this geometry of paths approach in Princeton. That's a very programmatic big industry there. Jim Ritter has written about that. So that's an example, I think, of what you're talking about anyway. I mean, the larger picture of programmatic approaches to mathematics, I mean, you can see a lot of programmatic things in the 19th century, even if they didn't use that word. I think Kronecker had a big program for sure. And, you know, it's a useful way to think about methodological conflicts and so forth. The Brill-Noether report is full of it too. I mean, it's another example. But yeah, I don't know. It's the best example I could come up with where the Erlanger program per se is really taken up. And it's not a discussion about the text, obviously. It's a discussion about the role of groups in differential geometry.
So I have Jeremy and Jesper and Rebecca.
Thank you for this, lovely. But I want to make a comment actually with ties into Michael's remark in a way, about Jordan and his traité.
Yes.
Because it's really something like maybe 3 books. It's huge, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a kind of what's a group story. It does do Galois theory very, very nicely. If you sit down and read it, it kind of tells you a story and you can put the roots of Galois in what Galois is about. It has its mistakes. It then has a lot of classical geometry.
Right.
And if you ever spent any time reading Hesse or Blücher or Klebsch or any kind of configuration of lines, right? It's crying out for some kind of way of talking about this, and that's what it provides. And I don't think up to that point, halfway through the book, it's got very many of the 7 seals on it, right? 1 or 2, right? Groups were a novel concept, and they were disliked by some people as just too weird, right? And then you get the second half of the book, which is something to do with the search for solvable groups in some sense. And it's half the book. I would give up 5 seals straight away.
Okay.
Right? And I think that's probably, when these people are saying it's got 7 seals on it, they would recognize what was going on in the first half of the book. And they just hadn't a clue. I don't know. I would expect them to find the second half of the book extremely hard, and I don't know at what point group theorists kind of weighed in and broke it down into bits and make it intelligible. But there's a lot of classical geometry that Klein can relate to in the first half. So not perhaps before 1872, but he must have, when he goes to Paris to see Rowe, have thought, well, when I get around to it, when I've got time, I'll the next thing, you know.
Well, yeah, no, and I think that's what the remark meant, and I'm not sure if at some point he and Jordan, of course, connect and so on. A couple of comments, though. So number one, he's well aware of the connection between Klebsch and Jordan, and Klebsch gave him a number of these examples that go into the book. So this was surely known to Klein. If not when he goes to Paris, then surely it's soon thereafter. The other thing, though, that, about it's what you said. I mean, you can only do so much at once. He's learning these things very quickly and reading not very deeply. And he knows about Serre's book, and he knows about Jordan's book, and this is written up in his report he writes a report and he sends it off to the club in Berlin and so forth. And at the very end, he comments about Jordan's traité, and there it's very clear he doesn't really know it. He just is impressed by this thick book, and that's about it. So, yeah, I think it's a work in progress, as I said.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, does he use the word analogy in his description? Yeah. Because it reminds me, how you described this. You have 2 different geometries, but then they have this group in common. And it sounds very much like what the mathematicians and physicists had done before about analogies.
Yeah, he uses that explicitly. They both do, actually. Yeah. It's well, especially the Galois theory idea. Tom Hawkins ran with that quite a bit, and it's hard to find. It's there for sure. They're thinking about the analogy between classical Galois theory and algebraic equations, and the idea that in differential equations that you can have you can study the groups that leave the integral curves invariant and so forth, and their structure, and have something like a solvable group. So that would be something. That explains some of the analogy that Lie will later use, with the classical group theoretic approach, and he tries to do the same type of thing with the hope It's a lifelong hope that lived on, right? That there's something where you can decide whether a differential equation can be reduced to quadratures. So that idea was there.
So Rebecca and Norbert and Joe, and you have the last question, and then we close the session.
Thank you. Right at the beginning, you said something about the reception of Klein's so-called program, and you talked about the translation into Italian and how that was distributed, but still, you said at the end of your slide, few probably read it and even fewer understood. Can you explain to me why you think that?
Yes, well, I mean, the book goes into detail about who read it in the first decade. So I only mentioned Poincaré had not. Certain people had. He circulated it like with reprints and so forth. You know, there was a set of things he gave to people. Max Noether knew it and understood the message very well, I think. But it's as far as the Italian translation, I mean, and Segre is very important for he knows line geometry. That's his earliest work is in line geometry. He also reworked Klein's dissertation, which classified quadratic line complexes. So that was all sitting there waiting to be studied and refined and so forth. The Italians make it, they're interested in general and geometrical stuff, of course, and so they wanted that to be in Italian, and then, yeah, the ball starts rolling. That's when Klein, by the way, starts teaching courses all the time about his earlier work. So he had been doing function theory and modular functions, automorphic functions, this and that, and he just drops all these other topics and he starts going back and lecturing on these things. So it's the period of the 1890s when people become aware of it and it starts to grow in fame. Yeah.
What was Robert Fricke's take on the Erlangen program? Did it differ from Klein's? Or I could ask the question more conceptually. I mean, Erlangen program and automorphic functions or forms.
Yeah.
Okay. How does this shape out?
Well, I can't speak for Fricke, but I think though the direction of your question I understand. Indeed, this becomes a problem for Klein and Lie in the 1880s because, and initially Lie thought it would be great, you know, you're trotting out your old work and so forth, why don't you republish the Erlangen program? I mean, he explicitly says so. But then it becomes kind of tricky, and Klein has this famous book on the icosahedron that he publishes in 1884. The preface to that thanks two people, Paul Gordon, with whom he worked hard on these things, and Sophus Lie. And you have to read the book to see, like, there's a dance going on here, because prior to that, Lie had his own participant's history of what he was doing that appeared in Mathematische Annalen. And so there's kind of a back and forth. How are we going to sort out our priorities, you might say? And there it's made explicit, and Lie certainly accepted it. So my colleague, whom I thank so profusely here, Sophus Lie, is the one who did the more difficult thing of, this is where they divide and conquer group theory, right? I mean, he did the more difficult thing, and I'm doing finite and discrete groups. So we divided this territory between us, and this becomes kind of the standard point of view that they took now. Now we're group theorists, and of course Lie was, to some extent anyway. Klein used group theory in his work, and that goes back to your Fricke question, I think, too, that basically it's an application of these ideas to function theory.
I was interested in what you had to say about Mittag-Leffler, because after the Franco-Prussian War, he hoped that Acta Mathematica would bring the Germans and the French mathematicians more or less together, and he translates quite a few German pieces into French because the French don't read German. And then he said he wasn't interested in doing that for the Erlangen program, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Just a little. I mean, again, I can't get into Mittag-Leffler's head either, but it's noteworthy because the Poincaré helped make the fame of Acta Mathematica with his 5 big articles, and then he learns about the Erlangen program from Sophus Lie, around the same time. The competition between Poincaré and Klein is over now, and he approaches Mittag-Leffler about this. And there were actual people who were willing to do the translation and everything. So why does Mittag-Leffler turn him down? Well, he doesn't give much of an answer, but I think the politics speak for themselves, you know, that Klein, who's persona non grata in Berlin, and a problematic figure for many people, and it's this triangle that, you know, Paris, Berlin, and now Acta Mathematica in Stockholm, and he's very deft about these things, so I think he was always very leery about Klein, and he's not going to help him make propaganda for some piece in his youth. That's my reading, but of course, as I say, I can only speculate. I think he quit making translations after the Cantor thing that had that blow up about Cantor's paper, and where he said, oh, you're 100 years ahead of your time here, and that was the end of that. Which Cantor somehow forgave him for that. Quite very forgiving fellow.
So I'm almost certainly going to oversimplify something, so please correct me. It sounds like when Klein writes the Erlangen program initially, he's doing classical geometry with transformations. But at the end of his career, and he's still talking about it, this is no longer what mathematics is. Now mathematics is group action on spaces, or something approaching that. And so it's almost impossible to reread it from a 50-year-old perspective.
Well, I mean, here's how you do it. I mean, there's Minkowski, right? So Minkowski comes along, he's a colleague of Klein's. They talk about Minkowski space before it becomes famous and whatnot. Klein writes about Minkowski space after his death and whatnot. And of course, he connects it because the geometry of Minkowski space isn't actually new. He's familiar with the geometry. And so this is the door he can just, I mean, Minkowski helps him get in that door right away. And then, of course, now what are you going to do when there's general relativity? Well, you can just widen the group. Now it's everything. And so you're looking at invariance for the full group of diffeomorphisms, people would say, or something like that. And then he's working with Emmy Noether and doing this famous stuff. So he's very adaptable, I think, with this sort of thing. You won't find any physics to speak of in the Erlangen program. He doesn't, you know, he's aware of things in physics, but of course it's a... Yeah.
But I'm not talking about Klein. I'm talking about people who talk about Klein.
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible for them to come back into this earlier perspective.
I agree completely. Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the point of my talk in a way. Yeah, right. It's a different world. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again, David.